This is the McKinsey podcast, where we help you make sense out of our world's toughest business challenges.
Welcome to the show. I'm Lucia Rahili.
And I'm Roberta Fasaro.
Hello, Roberta.
Hey, Lucia.
Roberta, I have consumers on my mind coming out of the holidays, both because I am a consumer and because I read about a sea change in terms of what motivates consumers to buy. McKinsey's recent article about the value now consumer says that until recently, consumer sentiment and spending tracked in sync, but not anymore. Now consumers might feel pessimistic about the economy and still spend. So super interesting insights, and folks can find the article on McKinsey.com.
All right, but you know something else that might influence consumer spending in 2025, Lucia, is the potential for increased tariffs. You know, tariffs are nothing new. They go all the way back to ancient Rome, where imported goods were taxed at a rate 25 times higher than domestic goods. I picked up this cool little fact from our article on tariffs. It digs into the history, explains when and why governments might use them, and it suggests ways that businesses can respond to them.
And now let's hear from McKinsey senior partners Shubham Singhal and Cindy Levy. I spoke with them in a recent McKinsey Live webinar about how to navigate our current geopolitical uncertainty.
So geopolitics, it's obviously been all over the headlines given rising tensions among regions across the globe. Cindy, why don't we start with a level set? What do we mean when we talk about geopolitics in today's context?
Thank you, Lucia. So in the spirit of level setting, we think of geopolitics as driven by competing strategic priorities of nations. And in doing so, nations will utilize a number of methods and measures to execute that strategic competition. And to your point, that does go beyond security. It includes industrial policies, it includes trade policies, and it does also include security policies, including conflict. And what we have found is that after a number of decades where the impact of geopolitics on most global companies was relatively benign, we now really see a trend break. And this is a very big value swing for companies. And we only need to look at some of the recent events and the impacts that they've had. So during the last Suez disruption, certain EU-China trade routes became 3x more costly because of that disruption. If you look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict, there are estimates to suggest that European companies lost 100 billion of enterprise value. And therefore, the value swings are significant. And as a consequence, leaders now say that this is the number one agenda that they believe could change value or create disruption for their enterprises. And therefore, geopolitical muscle involves a much more rigorous, quantitative, forward-looking view on all of these developments so that companies can really factor how to operate with them and to change strategic agendas.
Okay, that makes sense. You're talking about the potential for these value swings, and leaders need to be aware of those risks and to mitigate them. But I think hear you saying, Cindy, that these dynamics present new opportunities for leaders. Do I have that right? And if so, can you say more about that?
I think that the definition we are using and the engagement we're having with leaders is to really look at opportunities and risks. How is trade shifting? In what regions, for which subsectors, for which goods? Companies need to understand these because these do present immense opportunities for companies. And if I just touch on what companies are starting to build around geopolitical muscle, it's to deeply understand scenarios, to quantify them in terms of what they mean for the economies in which they operate and what they mean for their own forecasting, opportunities and risks, and also for their own operations in terms of where they might need to diversify. And just to give a couple of examples, some companies that want to diversify commercial markets, say in consumer goods or in manufactured products, are now saying, maybe I should bring forward my India market entry by a year. And how do I create an entry strategy that is fast and impactful? And we are expanding those conversations to market entry into 8 to 10 high growth markets. Global financial firms that are very connected to trade finance and payments, they're saying, how do I really understand these trade corridors? So Southeast Asia to US has blossomed as a real trade corridor. And have I really put my coverage, my infrastructure into Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia to make sure that I benefit from the growing trade in those regions? So those are examples of opportunities, and we actually see an imperative to look at both the opportunities and the risks.
So Shubham, let's turn to you. Clearly, business leaders have been navigating years of potentially destabilizing disruption, and the operating environment for leaders has been pretty tough and pretty uncertain. Is there some starting point for them to begin to assess where the opportunities lie for their organizations?
We advise them to look at and ask themselves the question, how does this affect value creation? And begin with understanding where it might drive growth. And Cindy gave some examples of it. But I'll give you a couple of others on this. There are at least two kinds of things there that we ask our clients to really kind of think about. One is to think about what is their global footprint of businesses that they have, the portfolio, the scale that they have, the market entry decisions they have made, where they have placed their operations. That is a very important part of it and drives a lot of the M&A divestiture partnerships. The second is around commercial acceleration. So I'll give you an example on commercial acceleration. One of the banks that has a pretty significant business around trade finance really stepped back, looked at how the trade corridors would shift over time. There are parts of Africa that they kind of looked at and said, okay, as the shifts play out and perhaps trade moves from the US-China corridor into others, how are we aligning our commercial teams against those opportunities? Are those teams briefed on what changes and triggers to watch that would prompt businesses to take action and move? Are they there and having the conversations with their customers at those points in time?
Talk to us now about the implications of these geopolitical shifts on talent for global businesses. Does being smart on geopolitics also mean rethinking where leaders hire or the kinds of skills they need in different geographies?
As we know, for a business, a big part of productivity and outcomes are driven through their talent infrastructure. And this is perhaps the biggest challenge that most global institutions have, because how do you knit together the greatest talent and have workforce cohesion across cultures and nationalities, but at the same time be able to deal with the shifts that you actually have to make? So, banks have been thinking about this. One global bank has looked at this and made some choices there. When they look at their call centers across multiple geographies, they have done a geopolitical scan, and not just based on business continuity to the point of opportunity, but also looking at how are labor skills that are available as well as wage rates moving, how are they likely to move, what domestic incentives might be in place, how does changes in labor laws and immigration patterns kind of change those equations, and then where do we need to place some of our people and operations so that it aligns with, again, back to the changes in cross-border trade flows, that it is also aligned with the markets at which we are operating. Issues and topics of visa, trade restrictions, which all get negotiated part of these trade agreements that governments do, become major decision points in placing your global talent footprint. And then being still able to kind of bring that group together in a way that it feels part of a global whole is a real kind of culture management challenge that most are contending with.
Cindy, how should executives be thinking about monitoring and mobilizing against these geopolitical risks at the corporate strategy level?
First of all, there will need to be much more rigorous scenarios available to management teams. And I think one can look a little bit at the banking sector that already has a pretty developed stress testing regimes, and we understand what they've been doing. And it's pretty sophisticated what they will do on geopolitical stress testing. They will be able to take potential trade policies or industrial policies and really run them through what will happen to GDP in all major markets, interest rates, inflation rates, and then what do they do? A series of actions coming out of those that really gets fed into a number of business decisions. A second element that we are discussing a lot is just how do I structure my global enterprise today in light of these geopolitical agendas? So we've had an era where globally optimized was always better. And I think now there are real questions really at two levels. First of all, do I need my operations in parts of the world organized in separate legal entities that perhaps have their own governance, their own boards? And do they need to be more readily separable or at least reducible under different scenarios? Do I need a tech and a data state that is much more separable for different parts of the world because of data priorities that each nation might have? Do I also need to actually make sure that certain functional processes like finance and people processes are a little bit more tailored to the region? The third is just like, what is my geopolitical operating model going to be? Some people have very significant in-house teams. Others rely on a really important flow of external insights. So how is that organized? And then finally, crisis scenarios. There's more and more of an imperative to really play through what could happen, what it will mean, think about it early, think about what responses might be. If the next wave of tariffs are going to be X, and I'm a big importer, say from China into the US, what are the next 5 countries I need to move to? So I think these are some of the corporate muscles that will need to be augmented in the next chapter.
Shubham, you mentioned earlier, tariffs on goods exchanged between the US and China have surged 6 times since 2017. Trade interventions have surged up 12-fold since 2010. Can you talk a little bit more about the implications and the way that leaders should be thinking about tariffs?
It's one of the questions that we're getting a lot right now. The first part of it is in thinking about implications that we advise our clients to think about is to understand what national interest is sought to be served by the imposition of tariffs. And that the number of reasons for which tariff being applied is broadening. And so I think that's an important part because it determines whether a tariff will go in and stay in for some long period of time, or perhaps be announced and then negotiated away, or perhaps be announced, go into place, and then be taken away once that is met. So 3 or 4 quickly. One is to balance trade. If there's a belief that around fair trade, that there isn't a fair exchange of trade, sure, there could be a set of tariffs that go in. And if a deal cannot be reached between nations, that it would continue to be in place. There's a second one, which is national security. There's a number of areas where tariffs in a strategic competition get placed, even without the trade view, just to kind of put up some walls. Some folks have called this the small yard, high fences model with tariffs that has kind of played out. A third could be increasing discussion whether tariffs can be used as a tool of foreign policy by the United States, more so than sanctions, preemptively be deployed as a means to bring parties to the table to negotiate settlements rather than have it open out into bigger conflicts and the like. Each one of these different types will have different longevity to them and a different set of outcomes. Now, once clients understand that, then they can act. Ones that are likely to go in and stay in do require, as we described earlier, changes to their supply chains, manufacturing sites, where they operate their business. Others require more tactical short-term management of exposures that they might have. Final thing we'd say in all of this that it requires is, Cindy mentioned this, but a very close ear to the ground to be able to understand what really is likely to play out versus what just shows up in the news.
Okay, several questions here on industry-specific implications. Cindy, you alluded to global financial institutions earlier in this discussion. Could you just say a bit more about how leaders of financial institutions and investors should be thinking about navigating these challenges?
Yeah, I think we're getting questions from all sectors, and we are developing sector-tailored perspectives appropriately so. I think if I just take financial services as an example, in general, financial institutions just need to understand all aspects of trade policy better, tariffs, export controls, because financial services often mirror the real economy and all of their prospects are linked to the real economy. So there is the need to understand over time what will happen subsector by subsector, which sectors are vulnerable, where might there be a change in corporate health in different sectors? Where do I need to worry about the credit worthiness, of different sectors in different geographies because of some of these exposure? And therefore, there's a number of medium-term builds that financial services will need to make. There are also some very immediate opportunities potentially coming up on the back of potential US election consequences that may happen. And it's things like digital assets. Will there be much more acceptance of digital assets as a set of national policies? A surge in transactions. Will regulation and the lessening of certain regulatory impediments create a wave of deal flow? And so there are some very immediate mobilizations needed to make sure that global financial firms are ready to move into these opportunities. And so I think exactly to Shubham's point, there's always going to be some policy moves that might be very immediate, but then there are some, I would call them more known knowns, medium-term secular trends, that also need to be responded to with capabilities built over time.
And Shubham, anything about tech leaders, anything data or tech leaders need to keep in mind?
I think the biggest change for the data and tech leaders is that the global infrastructure around data and your tech stack has just become impossible. And now many industries have dealt with this over time, so this is not a new problem, but for those that have that. And I think it is quite important to understand how do you optimize that to varying degrees of regulation and security controls being put in place, but do so in a way that is cost effective. And it does require quite fundamentally understanding your business, how the flows work across the business and how work gets done, and then being able to look at your technology stack and be able to realign it, including the earlier points around moving, operations around. But I'll leave it there. It's an interesting and complex question.
Yeah, it is. This has been a great discussion. Shubham and Cindy, thank you again for joining.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks so much for listening to the McKinsey podcast. I'm Lucia Rahili.
And I'm Roberta Fasaro.
Find us on McKinsey.com. We'll have a transcript of this episode up shortly.
And download the McKinsey Insights app, where you can find this podcast and other helpful content updated daily.
If you enjoyed the show, we'd love for you to leave a rating and a review.
We'll see you in 2 weeks.